Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rami Rubin. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, I would like to welcome you to this commemorative Torah study session. Today, we honor the lives lost and the people affected by the attack on three congregations, Dor Chadash, New Light, and Tree of Life, or L'Simcha, on October 27th, 2018, the 18th of Cheshvan, 5779. Our Torah study today is dedicated in memory of the 11 people who perished on this day 3 years ago. Please rise if you are able as we recite their names. Joyce Feinberg, Idit Baltcha, Bat Abba Menachem. Richard Godfried, Yosef Ben Chaim. Rose Mallinger, Razel Bat Avraham. Jerry Rabinowitz, Yehuda Ben Yechezkel Veselma. Cecil Rosenthal, Sissel Chaim Ben Eliezer. David Rosenthal, David Ben Eliezer. Bernice Simon, Bela Rachel Bat Moshe. Sylvan Simon. Zalman Shachna Ben Menachem Mendel. Daniel Stein, Daniel Avraham Ben Baruch. Melvin Wax, Moshe Gadol Ben Yosef. And Irving Younger, Yitzchak Chaim Ben Menachem. Zichronam Livracha. May their memories be a blessing. You may be seated.
Hi, my name is Beth Kislev. I'm a member of New Light Congregation, and I'm here to introduce Dr. Yael Ziegler. I just wanted to say Yael Ziegler is the Rosh Beit Midrash and academic director of Matan. I personally have been privileged to study at Matan in the summers twice, once in 1995 when I was pregnant with my oldest daughter, and once in the summer of 2006 when she was 10. She went on some of the Tehillim with us, and then she subsequently went back to spend a year studying at Nishmat, although my second daughter spent a year at a program the Midrash Torah of Va'avodah that was housed at Matan, and I got to study a little bit with some of her teachers when she was there in 2019. Dr. Ziegler has lectured widely on various Tanakh topics in Israel, North America, South Africa, Australia, and Europe. Dr. Ziegler is the author of Promises to Keep, The Oath and Biblical Narrative, Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World, and Ruth, From Alienation to Monarchy, which has been translated into Hebrew. And I just wanted to say, after the attack, the first evening after the attack, I couldn't sleep, and I went downstairs and I wanted to read something to focus my mind, and I turned to the Parsha, and the Parsha that week was the Parsha this week, Chayei Sarah, and immediately I was comforted because the Parsha tells us that how do you remember someone who's passed away? You remember their life, and it's very important to be able to take inspiration and spiritual sustenance from our texts. And in thinking about the things that Dr. Ziegler has written about, the fact that she's written both about Lamentations, which is a book about destruction, and about Ruth, which is a book about chesed, about acts of kindness, and about friendship and human connection, which are both things that have helped all of us. I know there are many of us who've been affected by the shooting in all kinds of ways on this Zoom. So I know that those acts of kindness and those personal connections have been of tremendous help to all of us. And I am really thrilled that Dr. Ziegler could be with us today. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ziegler, and for joining us. And we look forward to learning from your Torah.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Carly, should I begin?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. Okay, so I'm honored to take place in this commemorative Torah study. I've written on this PowerPoint that we dedicate today's Torah study in commemoration of the 11 lives lost and all of the people affected by the attack on these 3 Pittsburgh synagogues. May their memory be for a blessing. I'm going to be speaking about the Book of Lamentations. It's, of course, a book which is specifically about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple that took place in 586 BCE at the hands of the Babylonians. So we're talking about an event, of course, that happened a very long time ago. But this book has always been regarded throughout Jewish history as a blueprint for Jewish mourning, right? For learning how to cope with grief, with tragedy, with suffering, both on an individual and in a communal setting. And so I think it's really a very appropriate book to look at, when we're dealing with any sort of tragedy. Certainly on the scope of this tragedy, I think certainly necessitates us to look at the biblical book that deals with coping with tragedy. And one thing I will say about the Book of Lamentations is that it's also, by the way, colloquially oftentimes referred to as Echa. I'm just saying that just in case at some point I mistakenly refer to the book as Echa and not Lamentations. So it's the same book. One thing that has to be said about this book is that it's not a book that provides consolation, right? That's not its goal. Actually, the word nechama, which means comfort or consolation, appears 6 times in the book, every single time in the negative, right? Ein li menachem, ein menachem la, there is no consolation. This book is not about providing consolation. Actually, surprisingly, it also doesn't provide a systematic theology, right? This is not a Job-like book, which is trying to teach us how to understand God in the wake of these kinds of disasters. And yet, and part of what I want to show you today is that I think that it does, in presenting the tragedy, it does offer a kind of schematic theological approach to grief, namely, how do we view God? How do we view our relationship with God when dealing with tragedy? And certain guidelines, I think, to coping with tragedy, particularly on an individual level, as we're going to see in the middle chapter of the book. There are 5 chapters in this book. The middle chapter, of course, is chapter 3. And I do want to spend the bulk of our time here today looking carefully at that chapter. I will just say before we begin, that if anybody does have questions, I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. Feel free to write them in the chat, and I'll try to address whatever questions you have at the end. Obviously, we can't study this book in its entirety, but I do want to begin with a basic structural overview of the book. The book, of course, has 5 chapters. And so what I wanted to show you here is that it seems to be built in a chiastic or concentric structure. What I mean by that is that chapter 1 and chapter 5, they're similar chapters. They're similar chapters in terms of their language, in terms of their tone, in terms of their themes. And what I really want to see is that they are similar in terms of their theology, right? I think sometimes when the biblical books, when they create certain kinds of similarities or parallels, it's really drawing our attention to something that has theological meaning. And that's what we're going to see here. By the same token, and that's, of course, the periphery of the book, right? The book is enveloped by chapters 1 and 5. The 2 inner chapters, the one that surround our core of the book, our middle chapter, are chapters 2 and 4. Those chapters are very similar as well, similar in terms of language, in terms of tone, in terms of themes, and what I'm going to claim is in terms of theology. Okay, so we have these kind of concentric circles, all of which revolve around the center. Now, from a structural perspective, what we also see is that the book is highlighting chapter 3, right? That's the core of the book. It's the heart of the book, and it really is the heart of the book, right? So we're going to spend a lot of time on chapter 3, but I want to get a little bit of a sense of what I mean when I say that chapters 1 and 5 are similar, chapters 2 and 4 are similar. And I think that once we understand this, it's also going to give us a better sense of the theology of the book. And as I said, the book is not directly presenting a theology, but when we look at the structure, I think we're going to begin to see its theological message. Okay, so let's look at chapters 1 and 5. These chapters, as I said, they have very similar themes. Okay, they have very similar themes. They are both very quiet chapters. And what I mean by that is that these are not chapters that describe destruction, right? It's kind of almost jarring when you open the book of Lamentations and you expect to see a description of the destruction of Jerusalem, of the violent destruction of the temple, and you don't see that. Instead, the book opens with the words, Echa yashva vadad, ha'ir rabati am. How has the city sat lonely? That city that was once so filled with people. These are quiet chapters. These are lonely chapters. These are chapters that describe the emptiness of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, being a capital city, being a thriving, vibrant city that has the temple at its center. Well, these chapters describe the emptiness of Jerusalem following the destruction. And basically what these chapters are trying to do is show us what is no longer: desolation, what has passed from our lives with the destruction of Jerusalem, right? The loudest sound in the chapter are the tears of Jerusalem as she cries in the middle of the night, right? Bacho tivke balayla. She shall surely cry in the night, right? And one of the images, one of the predominant images that we have in both of these chapters is the image of the widows, right? Those who have lost their spouse, those who are feeling emptiness and loneliness. So that's the theme of both chapters 1 and 5. We're going to see that chapters 2 and 4 are very different. Now, I brought for you this chart. I kind of debated whether to bring it for you because I don't know about you, but when I look at it, it kind of gives me a headache. And I didn't bring any, any translations. But I thought it was still worth bringing the chart because really all I want to show you here, and I spent a lot of time color coordinating it so that you could see it very clearly, is how much linguistic similarity exists between chapter 1 and chapter 5. Every word that has a star or every phrase that has a star is a word or a phrase that appears in only these two chapters. That's the way the Bible draws our attention to correlations between chapters. These are very similar chapters linguistically. And when you hear these words in chapter 1, and then they repeat themselves in chapter 5, you say, oh, that reminds me of chapter 1. So what the book is doing is saying to us, chapter 1 and chapter 5 are very similar chapters. We'll get in a moment to the idea, the theology of these chapters. But first, I want to turn your attention to chapters 2 and 4. Okay. Oh, that is wrong. Okay, here I brought you another chart that may make you feel the same kind of headache. But again, these are words and phrases shared between chapters 2 and 4. Some of these words and phrases appear only in chapters 2 and 4. And all that really does is say to us, these are similar kinds of chapters. And actually, when you begin to read through these chapters, you realize that they're very similar chapters. They are loud. They are angry chapters. They describe the destruction of Jerusalem. They describe the fire of God that has been cast into Jerusalem, that has been, that has destroyed the city, that has destroyed the people. These are chapters that describe the terrible situation of a famine in the city, a famine which of course does not discriminate between the righteous and the evil, right? The famine actually, of course, as most mass tragedies do, affects everybody equally. And we have here many leaders that have been affected in chapters 2 and 4. The predominant image in chapters 2 and 4 are the death of the children. Of course, that relates to the famine. They are the most vulnerable members of society. And of course, their death brings with it, I think, a real theological problem. Okay, these chapters indeed are very similar. I can't elaborate more than that, but I hope that I've made the case that we have these kind of concentric circles in the Book of Lamentations. But the important point that I wanted to make is that these chapters are not just similar in terms of their language or in terms of their themes. They are also similar in terms of their theology. Chapters 1 and 5 are chapters that grope their way toward an admission of culpability, towards some kind of assumption of responsibility, right? Look at some of these verses. And by the way, this, don't forget that the Book of Lamentations is the culmination of a long period of biblical history, which included many prophets who came to warn the people, to rebuke the people, and to tell the people that if they don't improve their ways, this is what's going to happen. And so in both chapters 1 and 5, the people arrive at the conclusion, Tzadiku Hashem, Kifihu Mariti. God is just, for I have rebelled against his word. Chapter 5 has this kind of stunning conclusion, Oy na lanu ki chatanu, woe to us, for we have sinned. Okay, so that seems to kind of envelop the book, is this sense of taking responsibility in the wake of tragedy and continuing to regard God as a just God in spite of everything that happened. Well, I'm not sure that that terribly surprises us within the context of the Bible, but actually, maybe it does, because we have figures like, Avraham, who we read about in this past week's Parsha, who challenges God, right? Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat, will the judge of all the earth not do justice? And most of our most heroic biblical characters do challenge God, right? Think of Moshe, think of David, think of the prophets themselves, Chavakuk, who is a less known prophet, but one that really directly challenges God. And so it shouldn't surprise us that in chapters 2 and 4, the people never arrive at a conviction of sinfulness. They never arrive at the sense that things are right in the world. Instead, they describe God's terrible anger. The sense of anger at God is palpable. The human condition is presented here as being mired in absurdity, right? There's no sense of, everything is good. God is just. The world is good. In these two chapters, from a theological viewpoint, the situation seems quite unresolved. And so what I want to conclude here is that, at least from a cursory glance at the theology of the different chapters in the book of Lamentations, the two concentric circles seem to offer two totally different perceptions of the way in which we view God in the wake of human tragedy, right? Of course, my inclination is to ask the question, well, what's the correct theological response? Is it the response of chapters 1 and 5, where we say, okay, well, God is just, so it must be that we are not running our world right. It must be that we must turn inward and improve our ways. Or is it correct to feel that outrage and that anguish when we are confronted with the absurdity of the human condition? And of course, the answer is that it is both, right? It is the dialectic. It's the balance of both of these approaches. The Book of Lamentations advocates that we are constantly holding these two approaches in balance. On the one hand, we have a strong reliance on faith in a divine plan, in human responsibility. At the same time, the Book of Lamentations does not believe in simple, pat answers to complex, unresolvable questions and situations. On the one hand, what Lamentations teaches us is that we have to turn inward and in the wake of tragedy and try to improve ourselves and try to improve the world around us and try to, to search for divine justice. And at the same time, the book of Lamentations teaches us to cry out in anguish and in outrage in a bid to grapple with an absurd world, a world that doesn't always make sense. This is a very human, but also a deeply religious presentation of encountering God in the aftermath of tragedy. The reason that the Book of Lamentations, I think, is presented in a chiastic structure is because the book is presenting a complex, almost interminable oscillation between these two poles. On the one hand, we must always maintain a simple, pure faith in God's justice. Without that, we couldn't live in this world, right? The world would not be a world that we could live in. And on the other hand, we have to maintain this kind of burning outrage over the world's incomprehensibility. Otherwise, we wouldn't be fair to ourselves as humans, right? And so in my mind, I mean, this is kind of, a starting point. What I really want to draw our attention to is this middle chapter, but I couldn't even begin to talk about the Book of Lamentations and especially trying to find faith within the Book of Lamentations without presenting this general structure. And, at this point, I want to turn our attention to the middle chapter of Lamentations, and that is, of course, chapter 3. I think this is a wonderful chapter. It's also a very different sort of chapter in the book, right? Anybody who even glances at the Book of Lamentations immediately notes that there is something technically very different about chapter 3. And that is, well, if you were sitting in the same room with me, I'd actually ask you the question, but on Zoom, it's a little hard to do the question answer thing. So, what is different in chapter 3? Well, it's 3 times the length of any other chapter, but only 3 times the length in terms of the number of verses. Each verse only contains 1 sentence. And in chapters 1 and 2, there are 1/3 of the number of verses, but each verse contains 3 sentences. I don't know if you followed that, but basically it's the same word count between the chapters, but chapter 3 looks different. And the reason that it is 3 times the length in terms of verses is because it contains a triple acrostic. That is a phenomenon that we only have in one other chapter in the entire Bible, and that is in chapter 119. In the book of Psalms, we have an 8-fold acrostic poem. I mean, it's remarkable. We have Aleph. The letter Aleph appears in 8 psukim, and then the letter Bet in 8 psukim, 8 times, right? In our chapter as well, in chapter 3, we have a triple acrostic. It immediately draws our attention to this middle chapter. The chapter also seems different because it doesn't open with the word echa, right? The first 2 chapters in the book opened with the word echa. Echa is the opening of a lamentation. It means ech, which really means how, but it's ech with a sigh, right? It's how, right? It's a sigh of despair, and it opens a lament. And chapter 4 also opens with the word echa, not our chapter. Our chapter opens with the word ani, I, and already prepares us that there is a very different speaker in chapter 3. The main speakers in chapters 1 and 2 were Jerusalem. She spoke, right? We have the personification of Jerusalem, who speaks as the representative of the collective of the nation. And we also have the third person objective speaker who can stand outside of Jerusalem, judge her a little, kind of represent what's happening from an outsider's perspective. What we have not had so far in the book is the I of the individual. That is what chapter 3 is about. Chapter 3 tells the story of an individual. It's a very different sort of chapter, and it has very different themes. You know what we don't have in chapter 3, quite surprisingly and quite remarkably? We have no Jerusalem, we have no temple, we have no priests, we have no famine, no starvation, no siege, no exile, no city, no national tragedy at all. It is the story of the individual who suffers. It reminds me a little bit of what they tried to do at Yad Vashem when they commemorated the Holocaust. One of the ideas that guided them in putting together the museum was that when people hear 6 million, they lose sight of the individuals. It's too big a number, right? And the idea that they had was you've got to focus in on people, on their individual stories, on what they have, on what we lost in the loss of an individual rather than a community of 30,000 people, or a tragedy that spans 6 million people. Well, that's what this book does as well. In chapter 3, it focuses on an individual. This individual is called the Gever, right? The Gever, I'm gonna just adopt the position of Ibn Ezra that the Gever is every man, capital E, I might say, to be more politically correct, every human, right? I know every man is a term, but every human, right? Ani hagever, the word Gever is related to the word Gibor, right? It is related to the word for strength. It refers to a person, really a male person, right? But it's referring to a person who has to overcome something, right? Of course, it's a person who has undergone tragedy. And this chapter tells the story of an individual sufferer. And this sufferer, what we're going to see in this chapter, is any one person who went through any of the events in leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, the siege, the famine, the terrible events that take place during the actual rampage in Jerusalem, but also the individuals who suffer the aftermath, who go into exile, who have to contend with loss, right? I think that's what maybe some of you who are commemorating the terrible events in Pittsburgh, are thinking about the aftermath. That's, of course, also what the Book of Lamentations is giving us the tools to do, is to cope with, the aftermath of the tragedy. And it does so in chapter 3 by focusing our attention in on this individual, an individual who is extraordinary. He's extraordinary because he is so dynamic, right? Because through the course of the chapter, we watch him undergo a monumental change, right? It's a story of transformation. It enables us to move with this individual as he undergoes a remarkable change in his relationship with God, in his relationship with himself, and in his relationship with the community and the world around him. In that sense, I think it's truly a remarkable chapter. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of the outline of this chapter. In the first part of the chapter, we have the Gever. I'm calling him the Gever. That's what he's called throughout the chapter. This person, this human, describes his suffering, and his suffering is at the hands of God. Okay, that's the way he regards his suffering. Of course, theologically, it's correct, right? Whoever is happening to him, it is correct for him to assume that somehow it's his relationship with God that needs to be addressed here. He feels in this first part of the chapter deeply alienated from God. It is a Job-like chapter. It even seems to share some linguistic connections with certain parts of the book of Job. And he regards God as having positioned himself as his enemy. That was a convoluted sentence, but you understand what I mean, right? The Gever thought that God had positioned himself as the Gever's enemy, right? And this situation plunges the Gever into deep despair. Of course, his divine opponent is both intractable and undefeatable. And, that leaves him in a rather desperate situation. Reaching the depths of despair, the Gever begins to ponder God's ways, right? He embarks upon an actual theological exploration. And when I say that, and that shouldn't surprise us, except it's not common in the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is not particularly giving a lot of attention to theology, or not direct attention to theology. It's not giving almost any attention to theological reflections. And this section of the book, which comprises of 19 verses, which, remember what I said before, is 19 sentences, right? 19 sentences of theological reflections. It's not a lot, but it's what we've got. So we are going to talk about that. That's what lies in the second section of chapter 3. Following his theological reflections, the Gever returns to his suffering, right? And the suffering hasn't changed. There's no external change in the Gever's situation. He continues to suffer. He describes his suffering largely using the same kinds of descriptions that he described in part 1. But what we're going to see is he is a changed person. He has undergone a remarkable transformation. He reconnects with God. He reconnects with his community. And ultimately, of course, this comes from the fact that he has found God deep in himself. Okay, so this is the story of one anonymous person's tragedy, who is anyone, who is everyone. It represents for us the way in which human beings grapple with God, grapple with theology in the wake of tragedy. And it shows how, at the core, this part 2 here is the middle section of the middle chapter of the book. And I think what it reflects for us is that a person, if they dig down deep enough into their inner core, they will find the ability to reflect theologically. They will find, I hope, this deep core of faith. What he is, it's very, almost pictorial, because what surrounds the Gever is his suffering, but what he finds deep in the inner recesses of his being is faith. Okay, so in my mind, that's already enough to go on here. This is the structure of the book. The structure, I think, mirrors the human experience in which he is enveloped by suffering. Grief swirls around him, but he finds tranquility and discovery at the center. In a few minutes, we'll see what else he finds at the center here. But for the moment, I just wanted you to get a sense of the outline of the chapter. Let's turn our attention to this first section in the chapter, which seems to be the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. How does it start? It starts with the word ani. I mentioned it before. I am the man who has seen affliction at the rod of his anger. His, of course, being God, right? Me, he drove through the darkness and not the light. Against me, he has turned his hand all the day, right? God has worn away my flesh and my skin. He has shattered my bones, right? This is a really harsh description. What we see in this description, and you can read it in the English. I wasn't reading the English. I was just sort of loosely translating, from the Hebrew here. But you can sort of quickly read through the English if you'd like, and I will maybe summarize some of the major depictions, or some of the major kind of themes that emerge from this initial description of his suffering, from the Gever's initial description of his suffering. So the first thing that I think that we have to note is how deeply self-absorbed the Gever is. Now, this is not a judgment call. I'm not, I would use the word narcissistic, but I don't use it in a negative sense, right? There's something very healing about this, right? He is turning inward. Look at all the things that I highlighted in yellow. Ani, oti, bi, alai, right? All words about me. It is me, it is me, it is me. Now he talks about God, but he talks about God in the hidden third person. He never actually mentions God by name. God is out there somewhere tormenting him, but he is deeply focused on himself. And this point, I think, is made perhaps most poignantly in verse 8. I've put my cursor on verse 8 in Hebrew, when this man describes how trapped he feels in his own suffering. And he says as follows, Gam ki ezak va'ashavea satam tefilati. Even when I cry out and I plead, my prayer is closed off. My prayer is stonewalled, right? Now, it's a remarkable verse. The reason it's a remarkable verse is severalfold. First of all, he's saying he feels trapped, encircled, right? Look at all the words that I highlighted in green, which I won't read for the moment, are all about how he feels enveloped by this terrible experience that he has. It's surrounding him on all sides. He has no way of getting out. And I think that part of the reason is what I said before, because of course his enemy is God. If your enemy is God, well, God is undefeatable. So then, there's no way out. But then in verse 8, he hits upon an idea. I can pray to God. And maybe then I can emerge from my sense that there is no recourse to alleviating my suffering. And so he says, Gam ki ezak va'ashaveh satam tefilati, but that didn't work either. Even when I cry out and I plead, my prayer is shut off. But why? Why is his prayer shut off? What is missing from verse 8? Well, anybody who has encountered Buber's or Heschel's descriptions of prayer knows that there are two sides to the prayerful relationship. There is the I and there is the thou. What is this verse missing? The thou. Even when I cry out and I plead, my prayer is shut off. But where's the you, right? This person is so deeply, deeply mired in his own self-absorbed suffering that he can't see beyond the I. Okay, now, again, I'm not a psychologist. Maybe somebody on this Zoom is, but it would seem to me that this is a very reasonable and healthy first response to suffering, right? And yet he is sort of, trapped in his own feeling of suffering. The images that he uses here, darkness, encirclement, the sense of helplessness and hopelessness, all of this really paints this image of terrible despair, right? I'll show you my next slide and you'll see this. I like the pictures of the animals that I found here, but to me, what is so stunning in this initial description of his tormentor, God, is that the sufferer describes God as a bear lying in ambush, a lion that is in hiding, waiting to pounce. This is a remarkable and theologically very problematic depiction of God. What he's saying here when he describes God as a predatory animal is that God is not using any logic here. God is just behaving in this irrational, arbitrary, brutal, and cruel way in his attack on this Gever. So the Gever is absolutely devastated. He sees no way out. He's plunged in darkness. Another important theme, which we didn't talk about, is that his paths are twisted and convoluted. He doesn't know where to go. He doesn't know how to walk. Everything is dark and confusing. And of course, that's because he doesn't have God to help him. He has dismissed God from his life, or he feels that God has abandoned him, right? And so without God, he is left flailing on these twisted, dark paths from which there is no way to emerge. Okay, this is really, a summary of this description. He ends his description of his initial suffering with these really very categorical descriptions. Vatiznach mishalom nafshi nashiti tova. I lost the ability to find shalom, to find peace. I forgot what tov was. I have no peace. I have no happiness. I have no strength. I have no hope. Va'omar avad nitzchi v'tochalti mehashem. I said, I've lost my strength and I've lost my hope in God. So this is pretty much, when I read these sentences, I always think that, he's reached the bottom of despair. I picture this wretched person lying prone on the floor with no desire to get up, no reason to go on, no more strength to live, no more hope, no more goodness, no more peace, right? I would venture to say that this is oftentimes a general portrait of an early stage of coping with grief, right? That sense of hopelessness. And yet, this is the beginning of the turnaround, because this is the first time in the chapter that the Gever mentions God by name. Suddenly it becomes almost glaringly absent in the first 17 verses of the chapter. Suddenly he says, well, I've lost my hope in God. And then he says, wait a second, God. Oh yeah, God, right? And this kind of launches the next section of the chapter, in which he embarks on this stream of consciousness, these theological reflections, in which he begins to regain God. As he regains God, he regains hope, and he regains goodness, and he regains strength, and he regains his inner tranquility. This is what's going to happen at the center of the book. Okay, so let's look at the center of the book. So we have, the Gever describing the suffering, the theological reflections. Let's move into these theological reflections. Okay, the theological reflections take place in verses 21 through 39 of chapter 3, and they open with him discussing the ways of God, right? He's thinking about the ways of God. Remember, he just mentioned God by name, and he says, oh, God, yeah, God, he's the one who does chesed. He's the one who is loyal, who practices loving kindness. He's the one that is filled with compassion, with rachamim, okay? Verses 31 through 39 also contemplate the ways of God. And there again, he seems to kind of focus in on God as being a God of compassion. He says sometimes perhaps God, may punish, right? He says, possibly bad things could happen, but chadashim labekarim. God renews his compassion every morning. But what's in verses 27 through 30, right? Again, I'm showing you structure because I think that structure always reflects meaning. It always reflects substance. So this theological reflection is also structured in this kind of chiastic way. And we have something right here at the middle. What's at the middle of the middle of the middle? Did you follow that, right? We have the middle chapter. The middle section of the middle chapter are the theological reflections, and the middle of the theological reflections are verses 27 through 30. Okay, so I just wanted to show you what we have here in this first section, the ways of God, verses 21 through 26. Look at how he starts. Zot ashiv el libi al kein ochil. I'm going to think about this, and therefore I will have hope. Chaste Hashem, ki lo tamnu, ki lo chalu rachamav. God's kindness. Chesed also means loyalty. God's loyalty never ends. His mercies are never completed. Al kain ochilo. Therefore, I have hope in him. Okay, so that's what we have in that first section. In our last section of the Theological Reflections, verses 31 through 39, we're told God will never reject human beings forever. Ki im hoga, even if he afflicts people. Viricham kirov chasadav. He will go back to exercising mercy because of his abundant kindness. So, surrounding the Theological Reflections, we think about God. We think about the idea of a good God, a God who created the world, not in order to imprison people upon it and afflict them and torment them for his own perverse delight. That's the God of the pagan God that we find in all sorts of ancient Near Eastern, Ugaritic, etc. literature. That's not this God. This God is a God which is defined by kindness and mercy. But what do we have at the center of the book, at the center of the Theological Reflections? It is enveloped and embedded within this reflecting on God's mercies. And what do we find there? We find the word tov 3 times in a row. Remember, we said that there's a triple acrostic, right, in chapter 3. So generally, what happens is that, the chapter varies the word. It doesn't use the same word for all the tets. I mean, it does for the tets, but for all the alepphs, it doesn't use the same word. For all the bets, it doesn't use the same word. I mean, there's an attempt here to vary the letters, right? But with the letter tet, it is the same word 3 times in a row. That only appears with one other letter in the chapter, and that's the letter kaf, which has 3 times in a row the word ki, and I won't get into that right now. But that's what's at the center. What's at the center is the tov. And who finds tov at the center? Tov lagever. It is good for the gever. At the center of the book, we don't find God. God envelops the center, but at the center of the book, we find humans, and humans find themselves, and they find their ability to find good in their suffering. Again, it doesn't elaborate here. This is a rather sparse description, right? It's very much, just giving us kind of highlights. But the idea is that suffering is meant to produce introspection. Yeshev badad v'yidom. He should sit alone. Look at that word alone. That word appears only twice in the entire book. One in the opening verse and one at the center of the center of the center. I don't know. I assume all of you are in America. I'm in Israel right now. It's at night now. And but we all did kind of share a similar experience in the last year and a half. I would sum up our experience, for many of us as quarantines, masks, quarantines, hopefully not illness, right? And hopefully not worse than that. But the word in Hebrew for quarantine is bidud, right? Yeshev badad v'yidom. He should sit alone. Sitting alone is something that can produce good. That internal turning in the aftermath of tragedy, what I called before a kind of a narcissistic internal turning, that's something which is meant to produce good. How does he find the good? Well, that's for each individual. What is that good? That's for each individual to decide. But I think that what we have here at the center of the book is the idea that we believe in human resilience. We believe in the ability of human beings, even as they struggle with the world around them, which is often a difficult world, a hostile world, an absurd world, they can at the same time dig deep inside of themselves and embrace the inner tranquility that they can find from this kind of internal quest. This is faith in a turbulent world. Now, I have to begin to draw this to a conclusion. Carly, you want to give me a sign of how many minutes I have left? I'm looking.
So technically it's the session is done at 1:50, so we are done, but I mean, this is the last session of the day. I know people may have questions and
Okay.
so yeah.
Okay, with your permission, I'll just say what one final point, because this was the point that Beth, had asked me to address, and so I don't want to conclude without it. And that is that what does happen to the Gever in the aftermath of these theological reflections? I'm skipping this. What happens to him? What happens to this Gever? Sorry. What happens to this Gever is that he goes from being an I to being a we. He suddenly begins to speak in the first person plural, but we never had that voice yet in the book of Lamentations, and it's a remarkable voice. What happens to this Gever once he reconnects to God, once he reconnects to himself, is that he reconnects to his community, and he finds the strength to use his own experience of suffering in order to help his community, in order to join his community. And this is something that I think Beth was talking about a little bit at the beginning of the session. It's something that you also shared with me in an email before this session, that I think that this is certainly something that many people feel, and I know that the community in Pittsburgh feels as well, something that we do find the good in the coming together of the community, the beauty of people helping each other in the community. This is certainly something that we're seeing in this chapter. And the last point that I'll make is that we mentioned before that the chapter opens with the word ani, with the I, and it closes with the name Hashem, with God. And so ultimately, what this chapter is about how the individual finds God, not despite his suffering, but through it. And through the experience of his own introspection, his own finding himself, and his ability to give to his community, we have here the story of how he finds faith at the heart of this turbulent situation. And so with that, I will bring this session to a close. I'm honored to have been part of this, and I thank you for the opportunity to, together with you, commemorate the lives lost and the people affected, perhaps also in the merit of this Torah study, also to have been strengthened by it.
Thank you, Dr. Ziegler. Thank you for your teaching today, and thank you to all of you who participated as well. I would like to close with the Kaddish de Rabbanan by Carol Black in memory of her brother, Richard Gottfried, who was killed in the attack. I just linked to a text of the Kaddish in the chat.
Please rise if you're able. Yiskadao v'yiskadash, Shmei Rabah. V'yomah divrah hirutei v'yomlik malchutei. B'chayei hon of Yemei hon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agalah of Izman Kariv v'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shmei Rabah Mavorach li'olam umei umei. Yisbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpor v'yitramam v'yitnasei. V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal Shmei dekudasha barichu. Le'ela mim kol berchotav v'shirotav. Tush b'chotav v'nechematav damiron b'yomav yimru Amen. Al Yisrael v'yal Rabbanan v'yal Tamidehon. V'yal kol Tamidehon. V'yal kol mond oskin v'yaraita. Divi hadra hadain b'di v'chol atar v'atar. Yehei l'chon l'chon shlom rabba. Hina v'histachol v'rachamin. V'hayin arichu. U'azona aripa. U'parkona mikadam avuam divi shamaya v'yimru Amen. Yehei shlom rabba min shamaya. V'hayin tovim alena v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Osei shalom b'mramav. Hu barachmav yasei shalom. Alena v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen.
Amen.
Thank you everyone for joining. You're welcome to stay on if you want to, if you have questions, but this concludes this session.